Good morning, good afternoon. I'm Todd Everhart. I'm Clinical Vice President for Internal Medicine here at Signant Health. I'd like to welcome everyone to today's presentation, this webinar on measuring what matters, patient-reported tolerability assessment across oncology development. If I could have the next slide, please. I'm going to take just a minute to introduce our panelists. I'm Dr. Todd Everhart at Signant Health. Unfortunately, my esteemed colleague, Dr. Bill Byrom, has taken ill and is unable to join us today. So I'll be standing in his place as best I can, and we wish Bill a very speedy recovery, and we wish him well. We have with us today two of our other panelists I'd like to introduce, and you'll be hearing from them shortly. First, we have Dr. Josh Biber, who's the Associate Director of Oncology at Takeda. And then we also have Professor Devin Peipert, Professor of Health Outcomes Measurement at the University of Birmingham. And so we're very pleased to have both of them with us today as panelists. They're going to be presenting some information to you here in just a few minutes. But before we get into that, if I could have the next slide, let's go over just a couple of housekeeping items. So if you have questions during the meeting, you should have access to a question and answer panel within the application. So if you could put your questions there, I know that we also have a chat function, but if you could put questions and answers in the Q&A section, we'll be monitoring those. We did receive quite a few questions in advance through the registration process, and we're going to be trying to answer some of those as we go through the presentation today. Also, at the end of the webinar, we will be providing with a post-event survey. We would love for you to take the time to complete that quickly, provide us some feedback on the webinar today so that we can continue to use that information as we improve and present future webinars. I'll take the next slide, please. Let's take a look just quickly at the agenda. Again, I'm standing in for Dr. Bill Byrom today. And then I'm going to start out with a little bit of a presentation on the importance of patient-reported outcomes, particularly in oncology. And then I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Peipert, who's going to talk about measuring overall side effect bother, an interesting topic. And then we're going to follow that with a little bit of a panel discussion around that, particularly around translating bother to tolerability. After that, we're going to turn it over to Dr. Biber, who's going to give us a few minutes around the pharma perspective of everything that we're discussing today. And then we're going to have a brief panel discussion around particularly the Pro-CT-CAE and challenges across using that instrument across the stages of development. And then again, we'll finish up with that post-event survey. And if we have time at the end, we'll address some of those additional questions and answers as they've come through. So with that, I'll get us started here. I'm just going to start out with just a little bit of setting the stage with the importance of patient-reported outcomes and comparing that to what we've traditionally been using to measure tolerability in clinical studies. So if we'll take the next slide, please. When we rely on clinician-elicited adverse events, like we've traditionally done throughout oncology development, and we compare that to patient-reported symptoms through an instrument like the Pro-CT-CAE, you can see in this research that we actually probably are underreporting and undercapturing the true picture of the symptoms that patients are experiencing. And on this particular graph, you can see in blue, we have the percentage of patients reporting a symptom through the Pro-CT-CAE, and that's compared to the clinician-elicited adverse events as they're recorded usually in the ECRF in the orange bars. And you can see that we have a disproportion in the amount of symptoms reported between patients and clinicians. And it's not just the frequency of reporting, but if we look at the next slide, in a separate study, we can actually see there's a difference in the scoring or the severity of those events. And there's a significant difference in that between the patient-reported severity and the clinician-reported severity. And this has caught the attention of the regulators, because if we look at the next slide, during a conference, a workshop back in 2024, the summer of 2024, they talked about that relying on clinician-reported data limits, clinician-reported data limits accurate tolerability assessment, and that the validity of AE reports erode when it's filtered through research staff and clinicians. So your typical clinician-elicited adverse events. And the FDA in this workshop at that time stated that in the future, and I think that future is coming closer sooner and sooner, that tolerability assessments without patient-reported adverse events will be considered incomplete. So with that in mind as our backdrop, let's look at the next slide, please. We now have guidance. This guidance sat in draft for approximately 3 years and was finalized in October of 24. And we have some guidance from the regulatory authorities now on what they would like to see with regard to patient-reported outcomes in oncology studies. They've given us the 5 core domains of disease-related symptoms, symptomatic adverse events, overall side effect impact measure, which Dr. Peipert will be speaking about briefly here in a minute, physical function and role function. They also have mentioned in this guidance that they would like to see more frequent collection of this information, moving away from the typical site-based, cycle-based collection of PROs to more remote, more frequent assessment of PROs inter-visit and inter-cycle. And then capturing the cause for missing assessments, because one of the problems with traditionally using patient-reported outcome data in labeling is there's just a large amount of missing data. The regulatory authorities haven't known what to do with that. And so ultimately, a lot of the data that was collected never makes it to labeling. And so being able to collect the reason for missing this would be helpful as well. So we have this kind of guidance from the FDA, and I'm seeing both large and small companies, when they come to us planning their eCOA strategy for their studies, they're getting this direct feedback now that when they've reached out to the regulatory authorities and said, what would you like us to be doing for this study? They're getting essentially this feedback directly. So the agency does seem to be standing by the guidance that they've released. Next slide, please. So what is tolerability? The ICH definition of tolerability is the tolerability of a medical product represents the degree to which overt adverse effects can be tolerated by the subject. And with that as our backdrop, we're going to look at some of the instruments that we already have. If we look at the next slide, with measuring tolerability, whether that be the Pro-CTCAE and the collection of symptoms, whether that be the single item assessment of impact of treatment with something like the FACT-GP5. And then, of course, there's other core domains that the FDA has recommended, the physical function and the social function domains of the QOL-QC30. Are these current measures fit for purpose? Can we use these as is now, or are we looking for additional measures or additional instruments in the future? So with that as our backdrop, I'm happy to turn it over now to Dr. Peipert and have him speak a little bit around the topic of measuring overall side effect bother. Dr. Peipert?
Hi, lovely to be with everyone today, and thanks so much for having me. Go ahead and advance. So as Todd mentioned, overall side effect impact is one of the core domains that the US FDA has said they want to look at. And these several others, I'm going to focus on this one because I've done a good deal of research on how to use this concept to understand and gain new insights, unique insights on patients' treatment tolerability over the past several years. Go ahead, advance, please. So as a concept, it's relatively new, and we can think about sort of what we really mean by this. I think in its introduction, it was intended to be a way to look at the cumulative impact of multiple side effects, which we know is quite common for cancer treatments. This is critical for a few reasons, but one of the main ones is that it may help understand and be able to compare between two treatment arms that have different side effect profiles. It may be able to help us do that more fairly. And of course, it may be able to sort of represent a broader experience of the treatment than looking at individual side effects only. Go ahead and advance. So here's a question from an item from the Functional Assessment of Cancer Therapy system that has been used fairly frequently to capture this concept. It's called FACT item GP5. The language around that is, I am bothered by side effects of treatment, and you can see the response options here, of which there are 5. Yeah. So we divide these up into a couple different categories if we want to get at categorizing sort of higher versus lower bother. There are multiple ways to do this, and I think it's a very active area of research. But in general, we've said people with quite a bit or very much side effect bother is reported on GP5 are counted as having severe or high bother, and then low bother is the bottom 3 categories. That'll be useful in future slides. Go ahead and advance. So I'd like to start by highlighting some qualitative research that I led on with several colleagues to help understand what this item really gets at, and whether or not it's able to help us in understanding overall side effect bother. These came from 2 cognitive interview studies that looked at GP5, where we wanted to understand, is the GP5 understandable and relevant in the context of cancer treatment, and how do patients interpret the term bother in the context of GP5. This was published in support of care in cancer, and you can see that title here. Go ahead and advance. So I'll just look at this combined column here, which you see, which had in total 35 patients, and just, I don't want to get into the weeds of the data, but I do want to have folks look at, patients in general, when they were on treatment, felt that this question was easy to understand as it is. A small proportion said that they would make small modifications to it. The meaning was clear, and the vast majority were confident or very confident that in their ability to answer this question. So patients get it when they're on treatment. They know how to respond to it. Go ahead and advance. And when they came up with their answer to GP5, there were multiple different things that they could think about. One is the kind of thing we would want them to think about, which was an overall experience of chemotherapy or other types of cancer treatments that were impacting them. People said chemo when that was their treatment. They may be thinking about specific side effects that were driving their overall experience. They may even be thinking to a lesser degree about the broader psychological impacts that experiencing these side effects had on them. And I thought this was good, because one of the goals of this concept, I think, is to provide some flexibility in understanding people's experience. And this suggests that GP5 might be able to do that. Go ahead and advance. Thinking about bother, we did hear more about functional and emotional impact in responses from patients. Again, they also thought about some specific symptoms, but all of this maps on very closely to, I think, what we think about in terms of the way side effects impact people. And so we felt that this was good evidence of alignment between this item and that concept. Go ahead and advance. From a quantitative point of view, there's been a great deal of evaluation of the FACT GP5, looking at its reliability, validity, et cetera. I don't have time to review all of that here, but I do want to call attention to one study that I think is compelling, and that looked at GP5's ability to predict subsequent early treatment discontinuation due to adverse events in a trial among patients with newly diagnosed multiple myeloma. Go ahead and advance. Again, not to get into the weeds of the data here, but basically what we looked at was, at any particular assessment time point, if a patient reported that they were in high bother, what did that mean about their propensity or their likelihood of having dropped out due to adverse events by the next measurement time point. And across those, we found that patients in that high side effect bother category, meaning quite a bit or very much, had about 2.2 to 4.5 higher odds of early treatment discontinuation. So this maps on quite closely to some extent with what other ways we have at getting at treatment tolerability, like early treatment discontinuation, and tells about, is very predictive of patients' sort of behaviors that would lead to going off treatment due to adverse events. Go ahead and advance. This is a case where we implemented the GP5 quite descriptively to understand side effect bother in a ovarian cancer trial looking at a PARP inhibitor. And this was a study that looked at, an active treatment to a placebo control. We found it very useful there anyway. And this is, again, looking at patients, pi cycle who had, the proportion. So very simple descriptive presentation of the data, who had high side effect bother right across. And what you would expect, there's many more of those who are in the treatment arm. And I like this slide because even though it makes the active treatment look much more bothersome, which it may be in terms of side effects, this was also a very efficacious treatment. But this contributed to the ability to make an informed decision about whether or not the side effects of treatment were worth the efficacy, and in many cases, it was deemed that they were, and this helped provide an informed decision around that. It also shows ways that these data can be presented descriptively. Go ahead and advance. Another area I've worked around with GP5 to help its implementation in trials is some work that was funded by the FDA in collaboration with Jessica Roydhouse and several other fantastic POR researchers in this space to create endpoints using the estimand framework to see, well, okay, if GP5 was in your trial, how would you actually use that and have a look at whether or not one treatment was particularly bothersome relative to another treatment, et cetera. And I'd like to highlight a few points from that. Go ahead and advance. So the second, and there's two, the first one looks quite a bit like the slide I showed two slides back, where you're just looking at the proportion of individuals in high side effect bother. The second one is a bit more complicated in that it looks at the amount of time or cycles that patients who benefit from treatment at a specific cycle spend in that severe bother category. And we like this because it really tells you about, okay, if someone is enduring side effects of treatment but still benefiting from it in terms of its efficacy, how it helps you get at that calculus in terms of sort of what people are willing to put up with given that they're benefiting. This is looking at severe or high overall side effect bother using the GP5, and generally done on a safety population up to a particular pre-chosen cycle. Go ahead and advance. And so really at the end of the day, what you get is a comparison of in one arm versus another, what proportion of the cycles or time spent in that high side effect bother categorization did someone spend. And you would sort of favor arms that spent less time in that overall high side effect bother category. Go ahead and advance. And this was good because it's something very much like it, or the estimand itself showed up in a label for sulfatinib in thyroid cancer, where you can see, in the Loretto 531 study, they did look at the experimental treatment, sulfatinib compared to a standard, and looked at the mean proportion of time with high side effect bother in each of those, and that was informative. And the underlining above in that text shows they paired this in that label from FDA with more traditional metrics of treatment tolerability, which I think highlights the value of unique information, but also shows that this kind of information complements what we already know about how to understand patients' treatment tolerability. So it's not an intention to replace the way we're looking at, to some extent, treatment tolerability, but it does provide new value. Go ahead and advance. Okay, so I'm gonna wrap up here talking about efforts we've had around integrating PROs into early phase tolerability. And a few years ago, we were lucky to be able to bring together lots of different experts for international roundtable to determine if you were going to begin to look at tolerability in the early phase setting, that is right down to phase 1 and 2 trials, what would be the concepts you want, and would it be feasible to do in the first place? And I'm just going to highlight a few examples from that. Go ahead and advance. So we brought together, a host of individuals that included regulators from across the world, trialists, pharma reps, PR researchers, et cetera. And we compared both phase 1 and phase 2 for the 5 concepts introduced by the FDA's core outcome set, and ask, what would be part of your minimum PRO set for early phase trials, again, stratified by phase 1 and phase 2. Looking at the orange bars for phase 1, you can see that symptomatic adverse events and overall side effect summary were pretty much unanimously, or quite close to it, determined to be a key portion of what you would include in phase 1. Whereas in phase 2, there was interest in including the full set of those core concepts. And so, I think more work on this is to come. You can go ahead and advance the animation as well. Yeah, just highlighting the point I made. There's more work on this to come in terms of how you would actually do it. Some very exciting work is ongoing in that area. But it does show, I think, some enthusiasm and interest in the ability to use sort of what we already know about PROs that capture tolerability, including overall side effect impact, to do that. Go ahead and advance. Okay, so just a few take-home points here. I think we have a basis for methodological and regulatory understanding frameworks to select rigorous and patient-centric approaches for evaluating overall cumulative experience of adverse events. And this may offer some key advantages in particular studies, again, where you have maybe 2 or more arms that have different side effect profiles. How are you going to make a fair comparison across those? Something like overall side effect bother is a good way to do that, in addition to as a complement to specific side effects that patient can report on themselves. I'm not at all saying that it should be an alternative to specific side effects, but it may have some advantages for some comparisons. The GP5 is a good way to do this. We have lots of data running from qualitative to quantitative, supporting its fitness for this purpose. And so, I think we're really enthusiastic about seeing this in future trials. There are other measures that are single item measures like GP5. There's the ERO-RTC Q168. There are modified side effect bother items, et cetera. I'm highlighting evidence that we have on GP5. I think the others have not been evaluated as much, and they should be. Although I think we can hypothesize that they may serve a similar function. We are eager to see their inclusion, especially in early phase and dose finding, early phase, both in terms of dose finding and optimization, as well as right through to later phase trials, phase 3, and into the real world setting. And I'll close there.
Thanks so much, Devin. We've talked about this previously, but having an accurate baseline for patient-reported outcomes is vital to ensure that we can have an unbiased estimate of a change due to treatment. But how appropriate is the question asking about side effects of treatment to a patient not receiving treatment at the start of the study?
Thanks, Todd. So I think with GP5 or any item talking about specifically about the side effects of treatment, that's tricky at a baseline where they haven't had that treatment. So I didn't show these data, but as part of that same qualitative study, we looked at people who were just newly diagnosed and getting ready to start a systemic cancer therapy, maybe have had their surgery, but they weren't on that therapy yet. We gave them the GP5 and said, well, how did you come to your answer? And they said, well, you asked me, so I gave an answer. That was one thing. Another one was, I have expectations about what the side effects will be, and I'm bothered by those. Or perhaps they're responding based on a concomitant medication or some other medication they're on. If you look at any trial that has GP5 or other questions asking about side effects of a treatment that they haven't started yet, you will notice that not everyone says not at all, or not everyone says, there are responses there. And so those data helped us understand how patients are responding to questions like that. At this time, I think, we always want baseline data on things like any PRO, so we can sort of look at, well, as you said, basic part of sort of science. I think it's risky to look at baseline, and we might think about treating GP5 at this time anyway, a bit more like the way we treat, AEs, in terms of we're just looking at them on treatment and trying to understand them when they're on treatment. You'll see that the estimates I talked about do not include any baseline measurement.
Very good. So overall, Butler it's a nice measure in that it enables patients kind of weigh the totality of side effects to derive kind of a single assessment of the impact of treatment. So it's valuable in its own right, but and while it doesn't directly measure all aspects of tolerability, it's likely measuring some important aspects of tolerability. Um, and there was a comment, it looks like in our Q&A section that being bothered by side effects does not automatically translate into non-adherence or treatment discontinuation. Yet you've shown data that high bother can predict treatment discontinuation by the next visit in some of the data that you've shown. So what approach should we take to deriving tolerability insights from GP5 data specifically?
Yeah, I think you're right about that. So treatment tolerability is as we've discussed, is about your willingness or ability to stay on treatment given the side effects, right? And GP5 is very good at getting at that side effect aspect of it, but it's not asking you directly about, well, and I'll put it in the same boat all the other sort of PROs we're looking at this time. It's not asking you directly about your ability or willingness given X, Y, and Z. And your ability and willingness is likely down to lots of very specific life factors. What's your work life like? What's your family commitments like? All these are potentially very important aspects of treatment tolerability that we want to try to understand better. I'm very pleased with what we're getting done in terms of GP5. And, we're going to talk later about PRO-CTCE. I think we're doing a very good job at capturing some very important aspects of the tolerability story. Is there more out there we can get at? Probably so. I think we need to continue to do the science to figure out if we can do that in a way that's going to be useful in regulatory decision-making, useful in clinical settings, et cetera. And you may get different answers based on the need for the data.
And that's one thing I was just going to add. I know I come from the pharmaceutical perspective, but in that clinical setting, if you're able to, see that they're starting to have that high bother, drive that question of, okay, what specifically are you looking at? And can you help alleviate those symptoms so they can stay on treatment and continue that real world setting just beyond that even clinical trial standpoint?
Very good. And Josh, now that you've entered the discussion here, from a pharma perspective, in early phase, where do you see patient-reported tolerability being of most value? Is it in the very early first in man, or is it in later cohort expansion and dose finding phases?
Yeah, I think there's value in both scenarios. I think the challenge when you have first in man, first in human is you don't know what you should be asking from a tolerability perspective. And I believe we'll get to this in the second panel discussion. But an aspect like the PRO-CTCE has several domains and lots of questions. And so you could miss potentially the correct questions to be asking in first in man. But the other aspect is, could you figure out a way to kind of get a patient's sense of their symptoms in a more efficient and effective way, possibly using some technology. But I think either way, you want to have some kind of, whether it's CTCE or PRO-CTCE, some information to later inform cohort expansion and dose finding phases. So that way you are ensuring that you're asking the patients the most appropriate questions.
Very good. And before we move on to your section, Josh, one of the questions we've gotten from the audience is, GP5 is one of several measures we'd likely seek to use in an oncology study. We've got the FDA guidance, questions about, assessments of role function and physical function and other assessments that we may need to include. And a question we get frequently and got repeatedly in the pre-registration was around patient burden. So what are some best practices for reducing patient and site burden in PRO collection?
One thing that I know I'll touch on a little bit in my presentation is the advantages that technology allows us in making things more efficient, especially from a patient burden perspective and site burden. So the more that can be automated, the more things logistically can be figured out, the easier that is. That also goes to that whole patient burden aspects. We have lots of role functioning, physical functioning, disease symptoms. We all want to collect this data. And some items like the QLQC30 are 30 questions. And by using technology, it allows different instances to be used. So whether it's branching logic within certain items like the PRO-CTCE or using computer adaptive testing like PROMIS physical function or PROMIS role functioning, which make the ability to get a lot of scores in a very efficient, quick amount of time reduce that patient and site burden. But it's certainly that trade-off of also what's been used historically, and then how do we transition and using technology to better collect that information moving forward.
I think it's also important. I think we as an industry are often guilty of deciding for patients what patient burden is without asking patients what they consider to be burdensome in the course of participating in a clinical trial. And so I think it is very important that we don't forget that I do see, particularly in oncology, when I compare that to other therapeutic areas I work in, we fret over the patient burden over what I consider a smaller subset of questions that we typically ask, or a smaller subset of information that we'd like to receive from the patient, compared to other therapeutic areas where patients have equally debilitating or life-altering disease like Parkinson's disease, and the Parkinson's diary and the amount of data we require from them to collect, or complex seizure and epilepsy diaries and things like that. So in other therapeutic areas, I would say the burden is higher, and we routinely use those instruments and don't think as much about it. But in oncology, where we don't see as much, we still put that as a very high patient burden. And I think that we have to take into context what the patient considers to be high burden. I also think it's important. I think patients will tolerate PROs and those assessments if they believe that the information is doing something. And we've seen in non-clinical settings like the PROTECT study, where patients were in ongoing clinical care, and they had 90% compliance with patient-reported outcome completion on a weekly basis over a year's time, because that information was being used. It was being reviewed at the clinic on a regular basis. There were alerts going to the site, and that information was then translating into some sort of action or some sort of remediation for the patient. I think the same could be true in clinical trials. But if the patient feels that they're answering all these questions and they're just going into a black hole, then maybe it's not going to result in the same type of compliance or adherence. But I do think you're right with technology and efficient consideration of the instruments that we deploy, we can minimize the burden quite a bit. So I think with that, let's just turn it over to you, Josh, and let you go through your section here, particularly around the pro-CTCAE.
Yeah, and I'll just continue that last comment of the next, what I would call evolution with PROs is, how do you make PROs more actionable? How do the clinicians start to use that data moving forward to better care for patients? So, and that's kind of that full cycle of then the patients understand why they're completing it, because in my own experience over the last decade, there's that disconnect between why am I completing it and the clinician saying, what do I do with the information? So I think that's kind of that next evolution. So anyway, thank you, Signant, for having me. I would say this is probably titled a pharma perspective, because I certainly don't want to speak for the entire industry, and I'm sure there's other competing perspectives out there, but this is just kind of what I've seen and shared with my colleagues. Next slide, please. So why do patient-reported outcomes matter to begin with? For many years, the use of PROs, or including the patient voice, was kind of a nice to have. But what we've seen is now it's kind of central to demonstrating benefit, especially when you have clinical endpoints that don't fully capture how a patient feels or functions. And if we look at oncology specifically, overall survival is a common primary endpoint. But the PROs help capture that at what cost to quality of life, as we've kind of been explaining. And as we've seen, regulators are expecting more PRO data. Payers are also looking for a differentiation between new therapies and existing standard of care. And frankly, this is also what patients have been asking for many years, is to be included and have their perspective shared. So PROs help not only show that a therapy is working, but it also is able to show actually how much impact that therapy has on someone's day-to-day life. Next slide, please. So both the FDA and EMA have become more explicit in recent years about their perspectives on patient-reported outcomes. In general, they feel that patient-reported outcomes need to be fit for purpose. They need to be validated in the target population, and they need to be tied to a clinically meaningful change. The FDA in particular has kind of tightened their expectations around endpoint justification and estimates. And so globally, we're seeing overall alignment in principles, but they still have somewhat of a difference in their overall emphasis. So if you do have a trial that is a global trial or multinational, having that global PRO strategy really requires a lot of planning, so you're not trying to catch up at the end to make sure that you have those regulatory essentials. Next slide, please. So how is the pharma responding? Again, this is kind of a perspective on that, but we've kind of been seeing that companies are getting more proactive. PRO strategy is now part of the overall protocol development. It's not kind of an appendix that was added at the end by some exhausted team member right before the SAP lock. So we're involved in the very beginning, protocol development, statistical analysis planning. It starts with more rigorous instrument selection. There's more psychometric work early on, and also stronger dialogue with regulators during pre-IND and end-of-phase meetings as far as that feedback for PROs. The other thing is there's been a big cultural shift. I know for me personally, teams are starting to understand that it takes advanced planning and scientific rigor to get PROs into the trial and the discussions of labeling claims. And also teams are starting to understand the benefit and value that PRO evidence has in the overall risk-benefit analysis, which supports approvals, access, et cetera. So my job used to be going to the study teams and advocating for PROs and seeing if we could get them in, at what phase we can get them in. The big question was, well, what's the cost going to be? Is this going to hold up the trial? And now the negotiation isn't necessarily, are we going to include them or not? It's more of, what are we going to include and how many questions are we asking, and how we, make that data actionable? So that kind of cultural shift is already happening within the industry. Next slide, please. So in early phase, the overall goal is kind of exploration. As I said earlier, it's not going to be perfect. We're testing the overall feasibility. Can patients actually complete the measures without too much burden or confusion? Is there a topic that we've discussed that some will already and will continue to that's a topic that we've already discussed, we'll continue to discuss. Ideally, we would kind of explore which symptoms matter most and gather also qualitative data from the patients as to why these symptoms matter. And then based on this information, these early PRO signals can help differentiate tolerability or identify dose levels with better patient experience. So if you think of early PROs, early phase PROs, they're kind of like these overall scouting missions. They're collecting insights and information that can guide later confirmatory endpoints, which is also something we'll discuss in the next panel discussion. Next slide, please. As we move to late phase, we have a clearer understanding of how treatment is impacting quality of life. So at this stage, the PROs, we're looking for a validated PRO, the endpoints are justified, and we have those meaningful change thresholds clearly identified. Regulators are going to care about the estimates, what exactly you're trying to estimate and for whom. Missing data plans still need to be airtight. As we've said, we don't want to have too much missing data because reviewers don't want to see any kind of statistical improvising. And so while there has been this ability recently for PROs to be included in supporting labeling claims, that bar is still very high. So if that is the goal, you think you're going to have positive results, you have to make sure that all of this is airtight before moving forward. Next slide, please. So digital and ePRO considerations, this is a lot of what I've dealt with over the last 10 years. Now nearly all PROs are run through an electronic platform, and it's overall the medium of choice for most pharmaceutical companies. There's lots of upside. You can get real-time compliance monitoring. There's fewer transcription errors, and overall the data quality is much better. Electronic platforms can allow things like skipping algorithms or computer adaptive testing, as I alluded to previously. So you can gain greater insight with fewer questions and less patient burden. Of course, with everything, there's always a downside. So with technology, you will have technical failures, device issues, my Wi-Fi died again. And so ensuring that usability and reducing burden is critical, especially across different age groups and geographies. And this digital platform can be a huge enabler, but only when it's operationalized well. There's still going to be many trials out there that are using paper as a backup because of these issues, which makes data quality and consistency an issue. So the use of technology, BYOD, web backup, et cetera, will continue to evolve as eCOA companies find methods which work best for different patient populations. Next slide, please. So here are some big pain points that we've seen so far. First is selecting the right instrument, especially in conditions where you don't necessarily have a gold standard, or when it's kind of first in man, first in human, you don't know what to expect. In other industries, this is maybe more of a challenge in oncology. There's a lot of widely used PROs, but still selecting the appropriate one by phase, and also making sure that you have the correct symptoms that you're tracking also. Second, there are different regulatory differences, which can make your overall strategy a challenge, including variation in payer needs. You also have linguistic and cultural adaptations, because some concepts, like something might be moderately difficult or moderately discomfort, don't necessarily translate easily. An example is flight of stairs used to be used, and that doesn't necessarily translate to other languages. And so it got replaced from flight of stairs to 10 stairs to make it equitable across different languages. Fourth, establishing what those meaningful change thresholds are, especially when you have historical data that is limited. Again, fortunately in oncology, this is something we don't have to deal as much with, but it could still be a challenge based on the instruments that you're using. And finally, I think this is true for pretty much any trial, there's operational complexity. So you have different sites, patients, timelines, compliance, they all have to align. And I think this is also going to be touched on the next panel of how do you follow the FDA guidance to collect data at more time points and more efficiently, whether it's just physical function, role function, et cetera. And I think as an industry, we're still trying to find out what the best answers are for that. Last slide, please. All right, so go back one, sorry. So what does overall good look like? I think a strong PRO program shares a few traits. You have early regulatory alignment, validated instruments that truly capture the disease experience or burden. You have a clear analytical framework and hopefully a smooth digital execution. And I think most importantly, the genuine involvement of the patients throughout the development. When you are done, the PRO data is going to help strengthen the submission. But it also paints a clear picture of the most important part, which is the human impact of treatment. And so I think involving the patient throughout will definitely make that a stronger point.
Thanks, Josh. We've got lots of questions coming in around the pro CTCAE, so we'll try to address a couple of those here quickly. Just kind of the question I had, and some kind of, I'm going to combine some questions that we've gotten from the audience here. But when we use the pro CTCAE to evaluate toxicity, how do we use that data against specific AEs of interest? And then the other question is, how do we weigh the pro CTCAE data against the traditional clinician-derived events? And specifically, we had questions around, taking into consideration, we don't have the investigator's assessment of causality when you're just using the patient-reported symptom. How do you take into impact the patient's psychological component of the symptom when determining severity versus the more stringent kind of medically guided CTCAE grading that we get from clinician reported events? So how do we best make inferences from that pro CTCAE data?
Yeah, so I think generally speaking, the pro CTCAE, I would look at it as complementary data to other existing data like the CTCAE. Todd, I believe you showed earlier that patients do report more symptoms than the CTCAE. And I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. I think it's a better way to inform. There's been other research that have shown that psychologically patients are more honest with a piece of technology than they are a provider. Anecdotally, I've seen patients tell their physician, I didn't want to tell you the truth because I didn't want to upset you. I think you're doing a good job. And so I think the use of the pro CTCAE also can help inform that conversation between the patient and the provider. So instead of having a 30-minute appointment where in the last 5 minutes, the patient's like, oh, by the way, well, I've had really bad nausea and diarrhea this last week. Using the pro CTCAE data can help drive those conversations earlier in the appointment. That way, if there is some kind of modification they can do to treatment or manage side effects, it actually allows that to kind of happen naturally versus kind of at the rush at the end of the appointment.
Yeah, and a question we've seen come up a few times is pro CTCAE data considered safety data? I say no. I think the FDA says no as well, that it is a complement to, but does not replace standard CTCAE safety data. Um, I would argue though that if you're going to collect pro CTCAE data, it should be reviewed. And probably the best place to describe what that review process should look like is in the protocol. And so that the expectation of reviewing the symptoms when the patient comes in, so it can inform the clinician elicited collection of AEs and the transcription of that in the ECRF into your true safety database would be important. It doesn't make sense to collect it if it's not going to be used. And I actually think we talked about this earlier that if the patients believe that data is somehow being used to help in their care and their management during the course of the clinical trial participation, they're more likely to be forthcoming with that and collect it, and you'll get the data and not have a lot of missing data.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
So we know that pre-cycle assessments are less optimal in describing the toxicity of a treatment, as we typically measure those when patients are feeling well enough to begin their next cycle of therapy or whatever the case may be. And perhaps missing the worst effects of the kind of that intercycle period. Are sponsors starting to move away from just these purely pre-cycle on-site assessments and adopting strategies more aligned with those FDA core measures of more frequent assessment earlier in the study, earlier during the initiation of treatment?
I would say we are trying to. Right now, a lot of this discussion today has been around patient burden, and so um, some of the challenge comes with what your PRO solution is logistically. If you're using a tablet in clinic and it's going to be during a patient visit, then collecting more frequently is limited to how often the patient's in the clinic, and you don't want the patient to come in just to do a 5-minute eCOA assessment. And so I think there is a desire to. I know we've looked at specifically if you have multiple visits in a cycle, not necessarily each one is for treatment, but you have multiple visits. When's the most appropriate time also to collect PRO data? So the Pro CTC, it says in the last 7 days. So if you get it on day one of the cycle, are you actually capturing symptoms from that cycle, or are you collecting the end of the previous cycle? And so we are making decisions to try to best accurately reflect how the patient's doing. Other discussions of like using just the physical function part of the EORTC QLQC 30 in a more frequent standpoint. And so those discussions are happening. We are, like I said, as the more trials start to roll out, logistically, we're trying to figure that out also.
So what are some best practices for collection of pro CTCAE data in early phase when you have less knowledge about the side effect profile of the drug, particularly in a new compound? So how do you enable pre-selection of pro CTCAE items? Is there a way to use more of the CTCAE pro CTCAE library in early development, in early studies? How do you guys approach that?
I'll start on that one if it's all right. I think
Sure.
that's actually a place where GP5 shines, is that I'm not saying as a replacement for PRO CTC, but in that very early phase, when you don't know what the side effects are, I mean, you're guessing at maybe a common core that are across many different treatments. GP5 is good at getting directly to what that experience is, and maybe can do some of the work without having all of the specific side effects. And we heard that in the international consensus meeting that we did about how powerful something like an overall side effect bother item might be in that context.
Okay. And Josh,
Yeah,
go ahead.
I think it's certainly a challenge. As I alluded to earlier, you can't ask every single item in the Pro CTC library. That would be too burdensome. I think like patients would start to get the gloss eyes over what they're answering. But you also want to make sure you're capturing all the symptoms that are happening. And so what is the best way to do that? I know there's other solutions out there. I know Signant has a solution of the patients kind of selecting what symptoms they're having, and that would kind of branch to the Pro CTC items for them to complete then. I think, a challenge with that would be that each kind of patient is getting their own individual assessment. And so if you have a trial of 30 patients, you might only have 1 or 2 that report a certain pro-CTC AE item. Another solution might be where you have a kind of core set of items that you select and then ask the patients if they're bothered by any other ones in the pro-CTC library. I know we have also kind of shied away from the open text box just because that's kind of hard to group into. If they say I didn't have nausea, but I vomit, or I didn't, I didn't vomit, but I threw up 6 times or something like that. You're like, well, that's kind of the same thing. But I think I think at least the use of technology should make that easier than if you're trying to do it on a piece of paper, it's going to be pretty set. So there should be ways where you can kind of customize it moving forward a little bit, so you don't miss anything without having them answer every single question out there.
Yeah. Now, and as you mentioned, we've been exploring a way of presenting the entire pro-CTCAE in an early phase setting where you've got a limited number of patients, but it's in a branching logic manner so that the patient doesn't have to go through 120 questions, but they could answer a few questions and then branching logic would take them through the remainder of that assessment. So you would be able to collect a lot more symptoms from the pro-CTCAE without pre-selecting. But also try to, as we've been discussing, try to decrease the amount of burden it would be to the patient to try and answer that type of questionnaire. So, but also I think, and as you move into later phase, what's important then is if you have it fully open and they can answer to anything, when you get into later phases, you start to have a problem with your denominator, right? How do you compare moving forward if you don't have a common denominator of a single set of symptoms that you're specifically following? So can you comment on that a little bit?
Yeah, I think that would be a challenge if you have, I think it would be a challenge to show one symptom versus the other if 9 out of 10 had severe this because only 10 people reported it versus 120 over here. And so what is that kind of, especially, I know we've looked at pro-CTC kind of in a dichotomized way, similar to the FACT-GP5 that Dr. Piper showed earlier with the kind of low bother, high bother, high symptom versus low symptom. And so you might have a very high percent of people who reported nausea have, severe nausea, but it's a much lower denominator that might have a higher impact from a different symptom. So I think that's kind of where that, core plus model might be more efficient because you'd at least have a core set of items where everyone is kind of answering the same to begin with.
Very good. Very good. And then one more question about this, Josh. This is more moving into, this was a pre-registration question about looking at later phase in your phase 3 studies. How are you looking to satisfy these new FDA requirements that kind of came on in October 2024, specifically around capturing the reason for missing data, more frequent assessments, and are you using full instruments? Are you using the subscales? Are you doing both? And then there was a question from the audience today from our current attendees about how do you feel about collecting data at home via handhelds or BYOD and things like that compared to the in-office traditional way that we've been collecting pro data in the past?
Yeah, I think we are trying to do a little bit of all the above in the sense of we're in later phase, we're still using full instruments, but how do we start to incorporate like physical function and role functioning more often? As far as BYOD, I think that depends. I know plenty of other trials outside of oncology use BYOD and do like daily journals and those kind of things that are captured. And so I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility. Obviously, challenge with something like BYOD is what happens if a person doesn't have a device that's compatible. And so making sure that's part of your like plan of how do you get them a device that they can use. But I think overall, we are very responsive to what the FDA has published. And are looking to incorporate their guidance more and more into what we're doing.
Very good. Devin, I think you said that there was a previous question about CTCAE versus pro, and there was a point we didn't get to that you wanted to weigh in on.
Yeah, thanks, Todd. And I think I think the same attendee asked a similar kind of a question about updated CTCAE and grading, et cetera. And I think there's this goes back to the weighting of PRO versus when you have CTCAE. And I think an important distinction there is that CTCAE it can fall down in terms of its ability to capture tolerability, in that most of the time we understand low-grade AEs to be tolerable, and that may not be the case, and that's been demonstrated. So, low-grade diarrhea can still be quite bothersome and lead to someone not tolerating a treatment. We've demonstrated that in a few studies. And so I think that's a good opportunity to see where the different types of data really excel. Where CTCAE is great at safety, I think it's what it's designed for. PRO is actually telling you much more about tolerability in many of the cases. So if you want to weight CTCAE with more of a tolerability sort of type input, I think you can do that. We're figuring out how to do that better with the pros in terms of specific weighting schemes, et cetera. But I think it's important to get to that point that you ought to be weighting sort of what the patients say, because it may be telling you more about what you want to know for tolerability as opposed to safety.
Yeah, I agree. I think we would all be guilty at some point of looking at a long list of low grade, traditionally graded AEs and say this drug is well tolerated. But when the patient experienced all 10 of those symptoms at the same time, it was not very tolerable to them, and it had an impact. And I like to sometimes phrase, when we measure a patient's ability to continue or ability to participate or willingness to participate, there's a difference between the ability to do life while on treatment and versus the ability to live life while on treatment, right? And so I think that's important for us to bring that patient voice in, and how the overall treatment is affecting them is something that you can't always get just from a list of low-grade AEs or a list of graded AEs. And there was I think there was a comment about from the audience here that, and I think we've all thought this at one point or another, that patients will tolerate just about anything across many diseases, not just oncology, as long as the benefits outweigh the risks. And at first blush, that may seem true. I guess my question back to that would be, but should they? But should they have to tolerate anything to receive the benefit? And if you look at the early kinase inhibitors, I mean, over a 10-year period, 26% of the kinase inhibitors that were approved had a post-marketing commitment or a post-marketing requirement to look at lower doses. And so was there the opportunity earlier in development to better understand the tolerability of the drug, improve tolerability while maintaining the same efficacy? Could we do that earlier and not wait until post-marketing to get to those types of answers? And so, yes, I agree, and particularly life-threatening illnesses, that patients will be willing to tolerate quite a bit. But the question is, should they have to tolerate it? And is there a way to bring better dosing to market earlier? I'll take anybody else's comments on my editorial there, but.
Absolutely agree with you. Yeah, 100%. I think that's how you drive innovation, is to sort of, and FDA wants us to do that with Project Optimus and designs that are able to do that. And so, again, going back to, we're being called to do that.
Well, this has been absolutely fascinating. I appreciate both of you so much for being willing to participate in today's webinar. We're right here at the top of the hour. If we did not get to your question, we'd be happy to try and answer those questions and reach out to you individually. And I believe this has been recorded today. We'll be making the recording and slides available. And so if you have any other additional questions, please feel free to add those. We'll try to get to those individually. We cannot thank you enough for taking time out of your day or your evening to spend it with us. We think this is an important topic, and we really look forward to hearing from you. Hope you have a great rest of the afternoon or evening.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.